Section 15 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christopher Taylor. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842. By Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H. P. Paul. The Wild Swans.
Far away in the land to which the swallows fly when it is winter, dwelt a king who had 11 sons and 1 daughter named Eliza. The 11 brothers were princes, and each went to school with a star on his breast and a sword by his side. They wrote with diamond pencils on gold slates, and learned their lessons so quickly and read so easily that everyone might know they were princes. Their sister Eliza sat on a little stool of plate glass and had a book full of pictures, which had cost as much as half a kingdom. Oh, these children were indeed happy, but it was not to remain so always. Their father, who was king of the country, married a very wicked queen, who did not love the poor children at all. They knew this from the very first day after the wedding. In the palace there were great festivities, and the children played at receiving company. But instead of having, as usual, all the cakes and apples that were left, she gave them some sand in a teacup, and told them to pretend it was cake. The week after, she sent little Eliza into the country to a peasant and his wife, and then she told the king so many untrue things about the young princes that he gave himself no more trouble respecting them.
"Go out into the world and get your own living," said the queen. "Fly like great birds who have no voice." But she could not make them as ugly as she wished, for they were turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. Then, with a strange cry, they flew through the windows of the palace, over the park to the forest beyond. It was early morning when they passed the peasant's cottage, where their sister Eliza lay asleep in her room. They hovered over the roof, twisted their long necks and flapped their wings, but no one heard them or saw them, so they were at last obliged to fly away. High up in the clouds, and over the wide world they flew till they came to a thick, dark wood, which stretched far away to the seashore. Poor little Eliza was alone in her room playing with a green leaf, for she had no other playthings, and she pierced a hole through the leaf, and looked through it at the sun, and it was as if she saw her brother's clear eyes, and when the warm sun shone on her cheeks, she thought of all the kisses they had given her. One day passed just like another. Sometimes the winds rustled through the leaves of the rose bush and would whisper to the roses, "Who can be more beautiful than you?" But the roses would shake their heads and say, "Eliza is." And when the old woman sat at the cottage door on Sunday and read her hymn book, the wind would flutter the leaves and say to the book, "Who can be more pious than you?" And then the hymn book would answer, "Eliza." And the roses in the hymn book told the real truth. At 15 she returned home, but when the queen saw how beautiful she was, she became full of spite and hatred towards her. Willingly would she have turned her into a swan like her brothers, but she did not dare to do so yet, because the king wished to see his daughter. Early one morning the queen went into the bathroom. It was built of marble, and had soft cushions trimmed with the most beautiful tapestry. She took 3 toads with her, and kissed them, and said to one, "When Eliza comes to the bath, seat yourself upon her head, that she may become as stupid as you are." Then she said to another, "Place yourself on her forehead, that she may become as ugly as you are, and that her father may not know her. Rest on her heart," she whispered to the third. "Then she will have evil inclinations, and suffer in consequence." So she put the toads into the clear water, and they turned green immediately. She next called Eliza, and helped her to undress and get into the bath. As Eliza dipped her head under the water, one of the toads sat on her hair, a second on her forehead, and a third on her breast, but she did not seem to notice them. And when she rose out of the water, there were 3 red poppies floating upon it. Had not the creatures been venomous or been kissed by the witch, they would have been changed into red roses. At all events, they became flowers, because they had rested on Eliza's head and on her heart. She was too good and too innocent for witchcraft to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed her face with walnut juice, so that she was quite brown, and then she tangled her beautiful hair and smeared it with disgusting ointment, till it was quite impossible to recognize the beautiful Eliza. When her father saw her, he was much shocked, and declared she was not his daughter. No one but the watchdog and the swallows knew her, and they were only poor animals, and could say nothing. Then poor Eliza wept, and thought of her 11 brothers, who were all away. Sorrowfully, she stole away from the palace and walked the whole day over fields and moors till she came to the great forest. She knew not in what direction to go, but she was so unhappy and longed so for her brothers, who had been, like herself, driven out into the world, that she was determined to seek them. She had been but a short time in the wood when night came on, and she quite lost the path. So she laid herself down on the soft moss, offered up her evening prayer, and leaned her head against the stump of a tree. All nature was still, and the soft, mild air fanned her forehead. The light of hundreds of glowworms shone amidst the grass and the moss, like green fire, and she touched a twig with her hand, ever so lightly. The brilliant insects fell down around her like shooting stars. All night long she dreamt of her brothers. She and they were children again, playing together. She saw them writing with their diamond pencils on golden slates, while she looked at the beautiful picture book which had cost half a kingdom. They were not writing lines and letters, as they used to do, but descriptions of the noble deeds they had performed, and of all they had discovered and seen. In the picture book, too, everything was living. The birds sang, and the people came out of the book and spoke to Eliza and her brothers, but as the leaves turned over, they darted back again to their places that all might be in order. When she awoke, the sun was high in the heavens, yet she could not see him, for the lofty trees spread their branches thickly over her head, but his beams were glancing through the leaves here and there, like a golden mist. There was a sweet fragrance from the fresh green verdure, and the birds almost perched upon her shoulders. She heard water rippling from a number of springs, all flowing in a lake with golden sands. Bushes grew thickly around the lake, and at one spot an opening had been made by a deer, through which Eliza went down to the water. The lake was so clear that, had not the wind rustled the branches of the trees and the bushes so that they moved, they would have appeared as if painted in the depths of the lake, for every leaf was reflected in the water, whether it stood in the shade or the sunshine. As soon as Eliza saw her own face, she was quite terrified at finding it so brown and ugly. But when she wetted her little hand and rubbed her eyes and forehead, the white skin gleamed forth once more, and after she had undressed and dipped herself in the fresh water, a more beautiful king's daughter could not be found in the wide world. As soon as she had dressed herself again and braided her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring and drank some water out of the hollow of her hand. Then she wandered far into the forest, not knowing whither she went. She thought of her brothers, and felt sure that God had not forsaken her. It is God who makes the wild apples grow in the wood to satisfy the hungry, and he now led her to one of these trees, which was so loaded with fruit that the boughs bent beneath the weight. Here she held her noonday repast, placed props under the boughs, and then went into the gloomiest depths of the forest. It was so still that she could hear the sound of her own footsteps, as well as the rustling of every withered leaf which she crushed under her feet. Not a bird was to be seen. Not a sunbeam could penetrate through the large dark boughs of the trees. Their lofty trunks stood so close together that, when she looked before her, it seemed as if they were enclosed within trellis work. Such solitude she had never known before. The night was very dark. Not a single glowworm glittered in the moss. Sorrowfully, she laid herself down to sleep, and, after a while, it seemed to her as if the branches of the trees parted overhead, and that the mild eyes of angels looked down upon her from heaven. When she awoke in the morning, she knew not whether she had dreamt this, or if it had really been so. Then she continued her wandering, but she had not gone many steps forward when she met an old woman with berries in her basket, and she gave her a few to eat. Then Eliza asked her if she had not seen 11 princes riding through the forest. "No," replied the old woman, "but I saw yesterday 11 swans, with gold crowns on their heads, swimming on a river close by." Then she led Eliza a little distance further to a sloping bank, and at the foot of it wound a little river. The trees on its banks stretched their long leafy branches across the water towards each other, and where the growth prevented them from meeting naturally,
The roots had torn themselves away from the ground so that the branches might mingle their foliage as they hung over the water. Eliza bade the old woman farewell and walked by the flowing river till she reached the shore of the open sea. And there, before the young maiden's eyes, lay the glorious ocean, but not a sail appeared on its surface. Not even a boat could be seen. How was she to go farther? She noticed how the countless pebbles on the seashore had been smoothed and rounded by the action of the water. Glass, iron, stones, everything that lay there mingled together, had taken its shape from the same power, and felt as smooth, or even smoother than her own delicate hand. The water rolls on without weariness, she said, till all that is hard becomes smooth. So will I be unwearied in my task.
Thanks for your lessons, bright rolling waves. My heart tells me that you will lead me to my dear brothers.
On the foam-covered seaweeds lay 11 white swan feathers, which she gathered up and placed together. Drops of water lay upon them. Whether they were dewdrops or tears, no one could say. Lonely as it was on the seashore, she did not observe it, for the ever-moving sea showed more changes in a few hours than the most varying lake could produce during a whole year. If a black, heavy cloud arose, it was as if the sea said, "I can look dark and angry too." And then the wind blew, and the waves turned to white foam as they rolled. When the wind slept, and the clouds glowed with the red sunlight, then the sea looked like a rose leaf. But however quietly its white glassy surface rested, there was still a motion on the shore, as its waves rose and fell like the breast of a sleeping child. When the sun was about to set, Eliza saw 11 white swans with golden crowns on their heads, flying towards the land, one behind the other, like a long white ribbon. Then Eliza went down the slope from the shore, and hid herself behind the bushes. The swans alighted quite close to her and flapped their great white wings. As soon as the sun had disappeared under the water, the feathers of the swans fell off, and 11 beautiful princes, Eliza's brothers, stood near her. She uttered a loud cry, for, although they were very much changed, she knew them immediately. She sprang into their arms, and called them each by name. Then how happy the princes were at meeting their little sister again, for they recognized her, although she had grown so tall and beautiful. They laughed and they wept, and very soon understood how wickedly their mother had acted to them all. "We brothers," said the eldest, "fly about as wild swans, so long as the sun is in the sky. But as soon as it sinks behind the hills, we recover our human shape. Therefore, we must always be near a resting place for our feet before sunset. For if we should be flying towards the clouds at the time we recovered our natural shape as men, we should sink deep into the sea. We do not dwell here, but in a land just as fair that lies beyond the ocean, which we have to cross for a long distance. There is no island in our passage upon which we could pass the night, nothing but a little rock rising out of the sea, upon which we can scarcely stand with safety, even closely crowded together. If the sea is rough, the foam dashes over us, yet we thank God even for this rock. We have passed whole nights upon it, or we should never have reached our beloved fatherland, for our flight across the sea occupies 2 of the longest days in the year. We have permission to visit our home once in every year, and to remain 11 days, during which we fly across the forest to look once more at the palace where our father dwells, and where we were born, and at the church where our mother lies buried. Here it seems as if the very trees and bushes were related to us. The wild horses leap over the plains as we have seen them in our childhood. The charcoal burners sing the old songs to which we have danced as children. This is our fatherland, to which we are drawn by loving ties, and here we have found you, our dear little sister. 2 days longer we can remain here, and then we must fly away to a beautiful land which is not our home. And how can we take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat." "How can I break this spell?" said their sister. And then she talked about it nearly the whole night, only slumbering for a few hours. Eliza was awakened by the rustling of the swans' wings as they soared above. Her brothers were again changed to swans, and they flew in circles wider and wider till they were far away. But one of them, the youngest swan, remained behind, and laid his head in his sister's lap while she stroked his wings, and they remained together the whole day. Towards evening the rest came back, and as the sun went down they resumed their natural forms. "Tomorrow," said one, "we shall fly away, not to return again until a whole year has passed. But we cannot leave you here. Have you courage to go with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the wood, and will not all our wings be strong enough to fly with you over the sea? "Yes, take me with you," said Eliza. Then they spent the whole night in weaving a net with the pliant willow and rushes. It was very large and strong. Eliza laid herself down on the net, and when the sun rose, and her brothers again became wild swans, they took up the net with their beaks, and they flew up to the clouds with their dear sister, who still slept. The sunbeams fell on her face, therefore one of the swans soared over her head, so that his broad wings might shade her. They were far from the land when Eliza woke. She thought she must still be dreaming. It seemed so strange to her to feel herself being carried so high in the air over the sea. By her side lay a branch full of beautiful ripe berries, and a bundle of sweet roots. The youngest of her brothers had gathered them for her and placed them by her side. She smiled her thanks to him. She knew it was the same who had hovered over her to shade her with his wings. They were now so high that a large ship beneath them looked like a white seagull skimming the waves. A great cloud floating behind them appeared like a vast mountain, and upon it Eliza saw her own shadow and those of the 11 swans, looking gigantic in size. Altogether it formed a more beautiful picture than she had ever seen. But as the sun rose higher, and the clouds were left behind, the shadowy picture vanished away. Onward the whole day they flew through the air like a winged arrow, yet more slowly than usual, for they had their sister to carry. The weather seemed inclined to be stormy, and Eliza watched the sinking sun with great anxiety, for the little rock in the ocean was not yet in sight. It appeared to her as if the swans were making great efforts with their wings. Alas, she was the cause of their not advancing more quickly. When the sun set, they would change to men, fall into the sea and be drowned. Then she offered a prayer from her inmost heart, but still no appearance of the rock. Dark clouds came nearer. The gusts of wind told of a coming storm, while from a thick, heavy mass of clouds the lightning burst forth flash after flash. The sun had reached the edge of the sea when the swans darted down so swiftly that Eliza's head trembled. She believed they were falling, but they again soared onward. Presently she caught sight of the rock just below them, and by this time the sun was half hidden by the waves. The rock did not appear larger than a seal's head thrust out of the water. They sunk so rapidly that at the moment their feet touched the rock, it shone only like a star, and at last disappeared like the last spark in a piece of burnt paper. Then she saw her brothers standing closely round her with their arms linked together. There was but just room enough for them, and not the smallest space to spare. The sea dashed against the rock and covered them with spray. The heavens were lighted up with continual flashes, and peal after peal of thunder rolled. But the sister and brother sat holding each other's hands and singing hymns from which they gained hope and courage. In the early dawn the air became calm and still, and at sunrise the swans flew away from the rock with Eliza. The sea was still rough, and from their high position in the air the white foam on the dark green waves looked like millions of swans swimming on the water. As the sun rose higher, Eliza saw before her, floating on the air, a range of mountains with shining masses of ice on their summits. In the center rose a castle apparently a mile long, with rows of columns rising one above another, while around it palm trees waved and flowers bloomed as large as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land to which they were hastening. The swans shook their heads, for what she beheld were the beautiful ever-changing cloud palaces of the Fata Morgana, into which no mortal can enter. Eliza was still gazing at the scene when mountains, forests, and castles melted away, and 20 stately churches rose in their stead, with high towers and pointed Gothic windows. Eliza even fancied she could hear the tones of the organ, but it was the music of the murmuring sea which she heard. As they drew nearer to the churches, they also changed into a fleet of ships, which seemed to be sailing beneath her. But as she looked again, she found it was only a sea mist gliding over the ocean. So there continued to pass before her eyes a constant change of scene, till at last she saw the real land to which they were bound, with its blue mountains, its cedar forests, and its cities and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat on a rock, in front of a large cave, on the floor of which the overgrown yet delicate green creeping plants looked like an embroidered carpet. "Now we shall expect to hear what you dream of tonight," said the youngest brother, as he showed his sister her bedroom. "Heaven grant that I may dream how to save you," she replied. And this thought took such hold upon her mind that she prayed earnestly to God for help. and even in her sleep she continued to pray. Then it appeared to her as if she were flying high in the air towards the cloudy palace of the Fata Morgana, and a fairy came out to meet her, radiant and beautiful in appearance, and yet very much like the old woman who had given her berries in the wood, and who had told her of the swans with the golden crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be released," said she, "if you have only courage and perseverance. True, water is softer than your own delicate hands, and yet it polishes stones into shapes. It feels no pain as your fingers would feel. It has no soul, and cannot suffer such agony and torment as you will have to endure. Do you see the stinging nettle which I hold in my hand? Quantities of the same sort grow round the cave in which you sleep, but none will be of any use to you unless they grow upon the graves in a churchyard. These you must gather even while they burn blisters on your hands. Break them to pieces with your hands and feet, and they will become flax, from which you must spin and weave 11 coats with long sleeves. If these are then thrown over the 11 swans, the spell will be broken. But remember that from the moment you commence your task until it is finished, even should it occupy years of your life, you must not speak. The first words you utter will pierce through the hearts of your brothers like a deadly dagger. Their lives hang upon your tongue. Remember all I have told you." And as she finished speaking, she touched her hand lightly with the nettle, and a pain, as of burning fire, awoke Eliza. It was broad daylight, and close by where she had been sleeping lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She fell on her knees and offered her thanks to God. Then she went forth from the cave to begin her work with her delicate hands. She groped in amongst the ugly nettles, which burnt great blisters on her hands and arms, but she determined to bear it gladly if only she could release her dear brothers. So she bruised the nettles with her bare feet and spun the flax. At sunset her brothers returned, and were very much frightened when they found her dumb. They believed it to be some new sorcery of their wicked stepmother, but when they saw her hands they understood what she was doing on their behalf, and the youngest brother wept. And where his tears fell, the pain ceased, and the burning blisters vanished. She kept to her work all night, for she could not rest till she had released her dear brothers. During the whole of the following day, while her brothers were absent, she sat in solitude, but never before had the time flown so quickly. One coat was already finished, and she had begun the second, when she heard the huntsman's horn and was struck with fear. The sound came nearer and nearer. She heard the dogs barking, and fled with terror into the cave. She hastily bound together the nettles she had gathered into a bundle and set upon them. Immediately a great dog came bounding towards her out of the ravine, and then another and another. They barked loudly, ran back, and then came again. In a very few minutes all the huntsmen stood before the cave, and the handsomest of them was the king of the country. He advanced towards her, for he had never seen a more beautiful maiden. "How did you come here, my sweet child?" he asked. But Eliza shook her head. She dared not speak, at the cost of her brothers' lives, and she hid her hands under her apron, so that the king might not see how she must be suffering. "Come with me," he said. "Here you cannot remain. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silk and velvet. I will place a golden crown upon your head, and you shall dwell and rule and make your home in my richest castle." And then he lifted her on his horse. She wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I wish only for your happiness. A time will come when you will thank me for this." And then he galloped away over the mountains, holding her before him on his horse, and the hunters followed behind them. As the sun went down, they approached a fair royal city, with churches and cupolas. On arriving at the castle, the king led her into marble halls, where large fountains played, and where the walls and ceilings were covered with rich paintings. But she had no eyes for all these glorious sights. She could only mourn and weep. Patiently she allowed the women to array her in royal robes, to weave pearls in her hair, and to draw soft gloves over her blistered fingers. As she stood before them in all her rich dress, she looked so dazzlingly beautiful that the court bowed low in her presence. Then the king declared his intention of making her his bride, but the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the fair young maiden was only a witch who had blinded the king's eyes and bewitched his heart. But the king would not listen to this. He ordered the music to sound, the daintiest dishes to be served, and the loveliest maidens to dance. Afterwards he led her through fragrant gardens and lofty halls, but not a smile appeared on her lips or sparkled in her eyes. She looked the very picture of grief. Then the king opened the door of a little chamber in which she was to sleep. It was adorned with rich green tapestry, and resembled the cave in which he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax which she had spun from the nettles, and under the ceiling hung the coat she had made. These things had been brought away from the cave as curiosities by one of the huntsmen. "Here you can dream yourself back again in the old home in the cave," said the king. "Here is the work with which you employed yourself. It will amuse you now in the midst of all this splendor to think of that time." When Eliza saw all these things which lay so near her heart, a smile played around her mouth, and the crimson blood rushed to her cheeks. She thought of her brothers, and their release made her so joyful that she kissed the king's hand. Then he pressed her to his heart. Very soon the joyous church bells announced the marriage feast, and that the beautiful dumb girl out of the wood was to be made the queen of the country. Then the archbishop whispered wicked words in the king's ear, but they did not sink into his heart. The marriage was still to take place, and the archbishop himself had to place the crown on the bride's head. In his wicked spite, he pressed the narrow circlet so tightly on her forehead that it caused her pain. But a heavier weight encircled her heart, sorrow for her brothers. She felt not bodily pain. Her mouth was closed. A single word would cost the lives of her brothers. But she loved the kind, handsome king, who did everything to make her happy more and more each day. She loved him with all her heart, and her eyes beamed with the love she dared not speak. Oh, if she had only been able to confide in him and tell him of her grief! But dumb she must remain till her task was finished. Therefore, at night she crept away into her little chamber, which had been decked out to look like the cave, and quickly wove one coat after another. But when she began the seventh, she found she had no more flax. She knew that the nettles she wanted to use grew in the churchyard, and that she must pluck them herself. How should she get out there? "Oh, what is the pain in my fingers to the torment which my heart endures?" said she. "I must venture. I shall not be denied help from heaven." Then, with a trembling heart, as if she were about to perform a wicked deed, she crept into the garden in the broad moonlight, and passed through the narrow walks and the deserted streets, till she reached the churchyard. Then she saw on one of the broad tombstones a group of ghouls. These hideous creatures took off their rags as if they intended to bathe, and then, clawing open the fresh graves with their long, skinny fingers, pulled out the dead bodies and ate the flesh. Eliza had to pass close by them, and they fixed their wicked glances upon her, but she prayed silently, gathered the burning nettles, and carried them home with her to the castle. One person only had seen her, and that was the archbishop. He was awake while everybody was asleep. Now he thought his opinion was evidently correct. All was not right with the queen. She was a witch, and had bewitched the king and all the people. Secretly he told the king what he had seen and what he feared, and as the hard words came from his tongue, the carved images of the saints shook their heads as if they would say, "It is not so. Eliza is innocent." But the archbishop interpreted it in another way. He believed that they witnessed against her, and were shaking their heads at her wickedness. 2 large tears rolled down the king's cheeks, and he went home with doubt in his heart. And at night he pretended to sleep, but there came no real sleep to his eyes, for he saw Eliza get up every night and disappear in her own chamber. From day to day his brow became darker, and Eliza saw it, and did not understand the reason, but it alarmed her and made her heart tremble for her brothers. Her hot tears glittered like pearls on the regal velvet and diamonds, while all who saw her were wishing they could be queens. In the meantime she had almost finished her task. Only 1 coat of mail was wanting, but she had no flax left, and not a single nettle. Once more only, and for the last time, must she venture to the churchyard and pluck a few handfuls. She thought with terror of the solitary walk, and of the horrible ghouls, but her will was firm, as well as her trust in Providence. Eliza went, and the king and the archbishop followed her. They saw her vanish through the wicket gate into the churchyard, and when they came nearer they saw the ghouls sitting on the tombstone, as Eliza had seen them, and the king turned away his head, for he thought she was with them, she whose head had rested on his breast that very evening. The people must condemn her, said he, and she was very quickly condemned by everyone to suffer death by fire. Away from the gorgeous regal halls was she led to a dark, dreary cell, where the wind whistled through the iron bars. Instead of the velvet and silk dresses, they gave her the coats of mail which she had woven to cover her, and the bundle of nettles for a pillow. But nothing they could give her would have pleased her more.
She continued her task with joy, and prayed for help, while the street boys sang jeering songs about her, and not a soul comforted her with a kind word.
Towards evening, she heard at the grating the flutter of a swan's wing. It was her youngest brother. He had found his sister, and she sobbed for joy, although she knew that very likely this would be the last night she would have to live. But still she could hope, for her task was almost finished, and her brothers were come. Then the archbishop arrived, to be with her during her last hours, as he had promised the king. But she shook her head and begged him, by looks and gestures, not to stay. For in this night she knew she must finish her task, otherwise all her pain and tears and sleepless nights would have been suffered in vain. The archbishop withdrew, uttering bitter words against her, but poor Eliza knew that she was innocent, and diligently continued her work. The little mice ran about the floor. They dragged the nettles to her feet, to help as well as they could. And the thrush sat outside the grating of the window, and sang to her the whole night long, as sweetly as possible, to keep up her spirits. It was still twilight, and at least an hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers stood at the castle gate, and demanded to be brought before the king. They were told it could not be. It was yet almost night, and as the king slept they dared not disturb him. They threatened, they entreated. Then the guard appeared, and even the king himself, inquiring what all the noise meant. At this moment the sun rose. The 11 brothers were seen no more, but 11 wild swans flew away over the castle. And now all the people came streaming forth from the gates of the city to see the witch burnt. An old horse drew the cart on which she sat. They had dressed her in a garment of coarse sackcloth. Her lovely hair hung loose on her shoulders. Her cheeks were deadly pale. Her lips moved silently, while her fingers still worked at the green flax. Even on the way to death, she would not give up her task. The 10 coats of mail lay at her feet. She was working hard at the 11th, while the mob jeered her and said, "See the witch, how she mutters. She has no hymn book in her hand. She sits there with her ugly sorcery. Let us tear it in 1,000 pieces." And then they pressed towards her, and would have destroyed the coats of mail, but at the same moment 11 wild swans flew over her, and lighted on the cart. Then they flapped their large wings, and the crowd drew on one side in alarm. "It is a sign from heaven that she is innocent," whispered many of them, but they ventured not to say it aloud. As the executioner seized her by the hand, to lift her out of the cart, she hastily threw the 11 coats of mail over the swans, and they immediately became 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing instead of an arm, for she had not been able to finish the last sleeve of the coat. "Now I may speak," she exclaimed. "I am innocent." Then the people, who saw what happened, bowed to her as before a saint, but she sank lifeless in her brother's arms, overcome with suspense, anguish, and pain. "Yes, she is innocent," said the eldest brother. And then he related all that had taken place. And while he spoke, there rose in the air a fragrance as from millions of roses. Every piece of faggot in the pile had taken root, and threw out branches, and appeared a thick hedge, large and high, covered with roses, while above all bloomed a white and shining flower that glittered like a star. This flower the king plucked, and placed in Eliza's bosom, when she awoke from her swoon with peace and happiness in her heart. And all the church bells rang of themselves, and the birds came in great troops, and a marriage procession returned to the castle, such as no king had ever before seen.
End of The Wild Swans. Recording by Christopher Taylor. Section 16 of Hans Christian Andersen,
Fairytales and Short Stories Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christopher Taylor. Hans Christian Andersen. Fairytales and Short Stories Volume 1, 1835 to 1842. By Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Garden of Paradise.
There once was a king's son who had a larger and more beautiful collection of books than anyone else in the world, and full of splendid copperplate engravings. He could read and obtain information respecting every people of every land, but not a word could he find to explain the situation of the Garden of Paradise. And this was just what he most wished to know. His grandmother had told him, when he was quite a little boy, just old enough to go to school, that each flower in the Garden of Paradise was a sweet cake, that the pistils were full of rich wine, that on one flower history was written, on another geography or tables. So those who wished to learn their lessons had only to eat some of the cakes, and the more they ate, the more history, geography, or tables they knew. He believed it all then. But as he grew older and learnt more and more, he became wise enough to understand that the splendor of the Garden of Paradise must be very different to all this. Oh, why did Eve pluck the fruit from the tree of knowledge? Why did Adam eat the forbidden fruit? Thought the king's son. If I had been there, it would never have happened, and there would have been no sin in the world. The Garden of Paradise occupied all his thoughts till he reached his 17th year. One day he was walking alone in the wood, which was his greatest pleasure, when evening came on. The clouds gathered, and the rain poured down as if the sky had been a waterspout, and it was as dark as the bottom of a well at midnight. Sometimes he slipped over the smooth grass, or fell over stones that projected out of the rocky ground. Everything was dripping with moisture, and the poor prince had not a dry thread about him. He was obliged at last to climb over great blocks of stone, with water spurting from the thick moss. He began to feel quite faint, when he heard a most singular rushing noise, and saw before him a large cave from which came a blaze of light. In the middle of the cave an immense fire was burning, and a noble stag with its branching horns was placed on a spit between the trunks of 2 pine trees. It was turning slowly before the fire, and an elderly woman, as large and strong as if she had been a man in disguise, sat by, throwing one piece of wood after another into the flames. "Come in," she said to the prince. "Sit down by the fire and dry yourself." "There is a great draught here," said the prince, as he seated himself on the ground. "It will be worse when my sons come home," replied the woman. "You are now in the cavern of the winds, and my sons are the 4 winds of heaven. Can you understand that?" "Where are your sons?" asked the prince. "It is difficult to answer stupid questions," said the woman. "My sons have plenty of business on hand. They are playing at shuttlecock with the clouds up yonder in the king's hall," and she pointed upwards. "Oh, indeed," said the prince. "But you speak more roughly and harshly, and are not so gentle as the women I am used to." "Yes, that is because they have nothing else to do. But I am obliged to be harsh, to keep my boys in order, and I can do it, although they are so headstrong. Do you see those 4 sacks hanging on the wall? Well, they are just as much afraid of those sacks as you used to be of the rat behind the looking-glass. I can bend the boys together and put them in the sacks without any resistance on their parts, I can tell you. There they stay, and dare not attempt to come out until I allow them to do so. And here comes one of them." It was the north wind who came in, bringing with him a cold, piercing blast. Large hailstones rattled on the floor, and snowflakes were scattered around in all directions. He wore a bearskin dress and cloak. His sealskin cap was drawn over his ears, long icicles hung from his beard, and one hailstone after another rolled from the collar of his jacket. "Don't go too near the fire," said the prince, "or your hands and face will be frostbitten." "Frostbitten," said the north wind, with a loud laugh. "Why, frost is my greatest delight. What sort of a little snip are you? And how did you find your way to the cavern of the winds?" "He is my guest," said the old woman, "and if you are not satisfied with that explanation, you can go into the sack. Do you understand me?" That settled the matter. So the North Wind began to relate his adventures, whence he came, and where he had been for a whole month. I come from the polar seas, he said. I have been on Bear's Island with the Russian walrus hunters. I sat and slept at the helm of their ship as they sailed away from North Cape. Sometimes when I woke, the storm birds would fly about my legs. They are curious birds. They give one flap with their wings, and then on their outstretched pinions soar far away. Don't make such a long story of it, said the Mother of the Winds. What sort of a place is Bear's Island? A very beautiful place, where the floor for dancing is smooth and flat as a plate. Half-melted snow, partly covered with moss, sharp stones, and skeletons of walruses and polar bears lie all about, their gigantic limbs in a state of green decay. It would seem as if the sun never shone there. I blew gently to clear away the mist, and then I saw a little hut, which had been built from the wood of a wreck, and was covered with the skins of the walrus, the fleshy side outwards. It looked green and red, and on the roof sat a growling bear. Then I went to the seashore to look after birds' nests, and I saw the unfledged nestlings opening their mouths and screaming for food. I blew into the 1,000 little throats and quickly stopped their screaming. Farther on were walruses with pigs' heads and teeth a yard long, rolling about like great worms. You relate your adventures very well, my son, said the mother. It makes my mouth water to hear you. After that, continued the North Wind, the hunting commenced. The harpoon was flung into the breast of the walrus, so that a smoking stream of blood spurted forth like a fountain and besprinkled the ice. Then I thought of my own game. I began to blow and set my own ships, the great icebergs, sailing, so that they might crush the boats. Oh, how the sailors howled and cried out, but I howled louder than they. They were obliged to unload their cargo and throw their chests and the dead walruses on the ice. Then I sprinkled snow over them and left them in their crushed boats to drift southward and to taste salt water. They will never return to Bear's Island. So you have done mischief, said the Mother of the Winds. I shall leave others to tell the good I have done, he replied. But here comes my brother from the west. I like him best of all, for he has the smell of the sea about him and brings in a cold, fresh air as he enters. Is that the little Zephyr? Asked the prince. Yes, it is the little Zephyr, said the old woman. But he is not little now. In years gone by, he was a beautiful boy. Now that is all past. He came in, looking like a wild man, and he wore a slouched hat to protect his head from injury. In his hand, he carried a club, cut from a mahogany tree in the American forests, not a trifle to carry. Whence do you come? Asked the mother. I come from the wilds of the forests, where the thorny brambles form thick hedges between the trees, where the water snake lies in the wet grass, and mankind seems to be unknown. What were you doing there? I looked into the deep river and saw it rushing down from the rocks. The water drops mounted to the clouds and glittered in the rainbow. I saw the wild buffalo swimming in the river, but the strong tide carried him away amidst a flock of wild ducks, which flew into the air as the waters dashed onwards, leaving the buffalo to be hurled over the waterfall. This pleased me, so I raised a storm, which rooted up old trees and sent them floating down the river. And what else have you done? Asked the old woman. I have rushed wildly across the savannas. I have stroked the wild horses and shaken the cocoa-nuts from the trees. Yes, I have many stories to relate, but I need not tell everything I know. You know it all very well, don't you, old lady? And he kissed his mother so roughly that she nearly fell backwards. Oh, he was indeed a wild fellow. Now in came the south wind, with a turban and a flowing Bedouin cloak. How cold it is here, said he, throwing more wood on the fire. It's easy to feel that the north wind has arrived here before me. Why, it is hot enough here to roast a bear, said the north wind. You are a bear yourself, said the other. Do you want to be put in the sack, both of you, said the old woman. Sit down now on that stone yonder, and tell me where you have been. In Africa, mother. I went out with the Hottentots, who were lion hunting in the Kafir land, where the plains are covered with grass the color of a green olive, and here I ran races with the ostrich, but I soon outstripped him in swiftness. At last I came to the desert, in which lie the golden sands, looking like the bottom of the sea.
Here I met a caravan, and the travelers had just killed their last camel to obtain water. There was very little for them, and they continued their painful journey beneath the burning sun and over the hot sands, which stretched before them a vast, boundless desert. Then I rolled myself in the loose sand and whirled it in burning columns over their heads. The dromedaries stood still in terror, while the merchants drew their caftans over their heads and threw themselves on the ground before me, as they do before Allah, their God. Then I buried them beneath a pyramid of sand, which covers them all. When I blow that away on my next visit, the sun will bleach their bones, and travelers will see that others have been there before them. Otherwise, in such a wild desert, they might not believe it possible. So you have done nothing but evil, said the mother. Into the sack with you. And before he was aware, she had seized the south wind round the body and popped him into the bag. He rolled about on the floor till she set herself upon him to keep him still. These boys of yours are very lively, said the prince. Yes, she replied, but I know how to correct them when necessary. And here comes the fourth. In came the east wind, dressed like a Chinese. Oh, you come from that quarter, do you? Said she. I thought you had been in the Garden of Paradise. I am going there tomorrow, he replied. I have not been there for 100 years. I have just come from China, where I danced round the porcelain tower till all the bells jingled again. In the streets an official flogging was taking place, and bamboo canes were being broken on the shoulders of men of every high position, from the 1st to the 9th grade. They cried, "Many thanks, my fatherly benefactor," but I am sure the words did not come from their hearts. So I rang the bells till they sounded. Ding, ding, dong. You are a wild boy, said the old woman. It is well for you that you are going tomorrow to the Garden of Paradise. You always get improved in your education there. Drink deeply from the fountain of wisdom while you are there, and bring home a bottleful for me. That I will, said the east wind. But why have you put my brother South in a bag? Let him out, for I want him to tell me about the phoenix bird. The princess always wants to hear of this bird when I pay her my visit every 100 years. If you will open the sack, sweetest mother, I will give you 2 pocketfuls of tea, green and fresh as when I gathered it from the spot where it grew. Well, for the sake of the tea, and because you are my own boy, I will open the bag. She did so, and the south wind crept out, looking quite cast down, because the prince had seen his disgrace. There is a palm leaf for the princess, he said. The old phoenix, the only one in the world, gave it to me himself. He has scratched on it with his beak the whole of his history during the 100 years he has lived. She can there read how old Phoenix set fire to his own nest, and set upon it while it was burning, like a Hindu widow. The dry twigs around the nest crackled and smoked till the flames burst forth and consumed the phoenix to ashes. Amidst the fire lay an egg, red hot, which presently burst with a loud report, and out flew a young bird. He is the only phoenix in the world, and the king over all the other birds. He has bitten a hole in the leaf which I give you, and that is his greeting to the princess. Now let us have something to eat, said the mother of the winds. So they all sat down to feast on the roasted stag, and as the prince sat by the side of the east wind, they soon became good friends. Pray tell me, said the prince, who is that princess of whom you have been talking, and where lies the Garden of Paradise? Ho, ho, said the east wind. Would you like to go there? Well, you can fly off with me tomorrow, but I must tell you one thing. No human being has been there since the time of Adam and Eve. I suppose you have read of them in your Bible. Of course I have, said the prince. Well, continued the east wind, when they were driven out of the Garden of Paradise, it sunk into the earth, but it retained its warm sunshine, its balmy air, and all its splendor. The fairy queen lives there, in the island of happiness, where death never comes, and all is beautiful. I can manage to take you there tomorrow, if you will sit on my back. But now don't talk any more, for I want to go to sleep. And then they all slept. When the prince awoke in the early morning, he was not a little surprised at finding himself high up above the clouds. He was seated on the back of the east wind, who held him faithfully, and they were so high in the air that woods and fields, rivers and lakes, as they lay beneath them, looked like a painted map. Good morning, said the east wind. You might have slept on a while, for there is very little to see in that flat country over which we are passing unless you like to count the churches. They look like spots of chalk on a green board. The green board was the name he gave to the green fields and meadows. "It was very rude of me not to say goodbye to your mother and your brothers," said the prince. "They will excuse you as you were asleep," said the East Wind, and then they flew on faster than ever. The leaves and branches of the trees rustled as they passed. When they flew over seas and lakes, the waves rose higher, and the large ships dipped into the water like diving swans. As darkness came on, towards evening, the great towns looked charming. Lights were sparkling, now seen, now hidden, just as the sparks go out one after another on a piece of burnt paper. The prince clapped his hands with pleasure, but the East Wind advised him not to express his admiration in that manner, or he might fall down and find himself hanging on a church steeple. The eagle in the dark forests flies swiftly, but faster than he flew the East Wind. The Cossack on a small horse rides lightly o'er the plains, but lighter still, past the prince on the wings of the wind. "There are the Himalayas, the highest mountains in Asia," said the East Wind. "We shall soon reach the Garden of Paradise now." Then they turned southward, and the air became fragrant with the perfume of spices and flowers. Here figs and pomegranates grew wild, and the vines were covered with clusters of blue and purple grapes. Here they both descended to the earth, and stretched themselves on the soft grass, while the flowers bowed to the breath of the wind as if to welcome it. "Are we now in the Garden of Paradise?" asked the prince. "No, indeed," replied the East Wind, "but we shall be there very soon. Do you see that wall of rocks, and the cavern beneath it, over which the grapevines hang like a green curtain? Through that cavern we must pass. Wrap your cloak round you, for while the sun scorches you here, a few steps farther it will be icy cold. The bird flying past the entrance to the cavern feels as if one wing were in the region of summer, and the other in the depths of winter." "So this, then, is the way to the Garden of Paradise?" asked the prince as they entered the cavern. It was indeed cold, but the cold soon passed, for the East Wind spread his wings, and they gleamed like the brightest fire. As they passed on through this wonderful cave, the prince could see great blocks of stone from which water trickled, hanging over their heads in fantastic shapes. Sometimes it was so narrow that they had to creep on their hands and knees, while at other times it was lofty and wide like the free air. It had the appearance of a chapel for the dead, with petrified organs and silent pipes. "We seem to be passing through the Valley of Death to the Garden of Paradise," said the prince. But the East Wind answered not a word, only pointed forwards to a lovely blue light which gleamed in the distance. The blocks of stone assumed a misty appearance, till at last they looked like white clouds in moonlight. The air was fresh and balmy, like a breeze from the mountains perfumed with flowers from a valley of roses. A river, clear as the air itself, sparkled at their feet, while in its clear depths could be seen gold and silver fish sporting in the bright water, and purple eels emitting sparks of fire at every moment, while the broad leaves of the water lilies that floated on its surface flickered with all the colors of the rainbow. The flower, in its color of flame, seemed to receive its nourishment from the water, as a lamp is sustained by oil. A marble bridge of such exquisite workmanship that it appeared as if formed of lace and pearls led to the island of happiness, in which blossomed the Garden of Paradise. The East Wind took the prince in his arms and carried him over, while the flowers and the leaves sang the sweet songs of his childhood in tones so full and soft that no human voice could venture to imitate. Within the garden grew large trees full of sap, but whether they were palm trees or gigantic water plants, the prince knew not. The climbing plants hung in garlands of green and gold, like the illuminations on the margins of old missals or twined among the initial letters. Birds, flowers, and festoons appeared intermingled in seeming confusion. Close by, on the grass, stood a group of peacocks with radiant tails outspread to the sun. The prince touched them, and found to his surprise that they were not really birds, but the leaves of the burdock tree, which shone with the colors of a peacock's tail. The lion and the tiger, gentle and tame, were springing about like playful cats among the green bushes, whose perfume was like the fragrant blossom of the olive. The plumage of the wood pigeon glistened like pearls as it struck the lion's mane with its wings, while the antelope, usually so shy, stood near, nodding its head as if it wished to join in the frolic. The Fairy of Paradise next made her appearance. Her raiment shone like the sun, and her serene countenance beamed with happiness like that of a mother rejoicing over her child. She was young and beautiful, and a train of lovely maidens followed her, each wearing a bright star in her hair. The east wind gave her the palm leaf, on which was written the history of the phoenix, and her eyes sparkled with joy. She then took the prince by the hand and led him into her palace, the walls of which were richly colored, like a tulip leaf when it is turned to the sun. The roof had the appearance of an inverted flower, and the colors grew deeper and brighter to the gazer. The prince walked to a window and saw what appeared to be the tree of knowledge of good and evil, with Adam and Eve standing by, and the serpent near them. "I thought they were banished from paradise," he said. The princess smiled and told him that time had engraved each event on a window pane in the form of a picture, but, unlike other pictures, all that it represented lived and moved. The leaves rustled, and the persons went and came, as in a looking-glass. He looked through another pane, and saw the ladder in Jacob's dream, on which the angels were ascending and descending with outspread wings. All that had ever happened in the world here lived and moved on the panes of glass, in pictures such as time alone could produce. The fairy now led the prince into a large lofty room with transparent walls, through which the light shone. Here were portraits, each one appearing more beautiful than the other, millions of happy beings, whose laughter and song mingled in one sweet melody. Some of these were in such an elevated position that they appeared smaller than the smallest rosebud, or like pencil dots on paper. In the center of the hall stood a tree, with drooping branches from which hung golden apples, both great and small, looking like oranges among the green leaves. It was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from which Adam and Eve had plucked and eaten the forbidden fruit, and from each leaf trickled a bright red dewdrop, as if the tree were weeping tears of blood for their sin. "Let us now take the boat," said the fairy. "A sail on the cool waters will refresh us. But we shall not move from the spot. Although the boat may rock on the swelling water, the countries of the world will glide before us, but we shall remain still." It was indeed wonderful to behold. First came the lofty Alps, snow-clad and covered with clouds and dark pines. The horn resounded, and the shepherds sang merrily in the valleys. The banana trees bent their drooping branches over the boat. Black swans floated on the water, and singular animals and flowers appeared on the distant shore. New Holland, the fifth division of the world, now glided by, with mountains in the background, looking blue in the distance. They heard the song of the priests, and saw the wild dance of the savage to the sound of the drums and trumpets of bone. The pyramids of Egypt rising to the clouds, columns and sphinxes, overthrown and buried in the sand, followed in their turn, while the northern lights flashed out over the extinguished volcanoes of the north, in fireworks none could imitate. The prince was delighted, and yet he saw hundreds of other wonderful things, more than could be described. "Can I stay here forever?" asked he. "That depends upon yourself," replied the fairy. "If you do not, like Adam, long for what is forbidden, you can remain here always." "I should not touch the fruit on the tree of knowledge," said the prince. "There is abundance of fruit equally beautiful." "Examine your own heart," said the princess, "and if you do not feel sure of its strength, return with the east wind who brought you. He is about to fly back, and will not return here for 100 years. The time will not seem to you more than 100 hours, yet even that is a long time for temptation and resistance. Every evening when I leave you, I shall be obliged to say, 'Come with me,' and to beckon to you with my hand. But you must not listen, nor move from your place to follow me, for with every step you will find your power to resist weaker. If once you attempted to follow me, you would soon find yourself in the hall, where grows the tree of knowledge, for I sleep beneath its perfumed branches. If you stooped over me, I should be forced to smile. If you then kissed my lips, the garden of paradise would sink into the earth, and to you it would be lost. A keen wind from the desert would howl around you, cold rain would fall on your head, and sorrow and woe would be your future lot." "I will remain," said the prince. So the east wind kissed him on the forehead, and said, "Be firm, then shall we meet again when 100 years have passed. Farewell, farewell." Then the east wind spread his broad pinions, which shone like the lightning in harvest, or as the northern lights in a cold winter. "Farewell, farewell," echoed the trees and the flowers. Storks and pelicans flew after him in feathery bands to accompany him to the boundaries of the garden. "Now we will commence dancing," said the fairy, "and when it is nearly over at sunset, while I am dancing with you, I shall make a sign and ask you to follow me, but do not obey. I shall be obliged to repeat the same thing for 100 years, and each time, when the trial is past, if you resist, you will gain strength, till resistance becomes easy, and at last the temptation will be quite overcome. This evening, as it will be the first time, I have warned you." After this the fairy led him into a large hall, filled with transparent lilies. The yellow stamina from each flower formed a tiny golden harp, from which came forth strains of music like the mingled tones of flute and lyre. Beautiful maidens, slender and graceful in form, and robed in transparent gauze, floated through the dance, and sang of the happy life in the garden of paradise, where death never entered, and where all would bloom forever in immortal youth. As the sun went down, the whole heavens became crimson and gold, and tinted the lilies with the hue of roses. Then the beautiful maidens offered to the prince sparkling wine, and when he had drank, he felt happiness greater than he had ever known before. Presently the background of the hall opened, and the tree of knowledge appeared, surrounded by a halo of glory that almost blinded him. Voices, soft and lovely as his mother's, sounded in his ears, as if she were singing to him, "My child, my beloved child." Then the fairy beckoned to him, and said in sweet accents, "Come with me, come with me." Forgetting his promise, forgetting it even on the very first evening, he rushed towards her, while she continued to beckon to him and to smile. The fragrance around him overpowered his senses. The music from the harp sounded more entrancing, while around the tree appeared millions of smiling faces, nodding and singing. Man should know everything. Man is the lord of the earth. The tree of knowledge no longer wept tears of blood, for the dewdrops shone like glittering stars. "Come, come," continued that thrilling voice, and the prince followed the call. At every step his cheeks glowed, and the blood rushed wildly through his veins. "I must follow," he cried. "It is not a sin. It cannot be. To follow beauty and joy. I only want to see her sleep, and nothing will happen unless I kiss her. And that I will not do, for I have strength to resist and a determined will." The fairy threw off her dazzling attire, bent back the boughs, and in another moment was hidden among them. "I have not sinned yet," said the prince, "and I will not." And then he pushed aside the boughs to follow the princess. She was lying already asleep, beautiful as only a fairy in the garden of paradise could be. He smiled as he bent over her, and he saw tears trembling out of her beautiful eyelashes. "Do you weep for me?" he whispered. "Oh, weep not, thou loveliest of women. Now do I begin to understand the happiness of paradise. I feel it to my inmost soul, in every thought. A new life is born within me. One moment of such happiness is worth an eternity of darkness and woe." He stooped and kissed the tears from her eyes, and touched her lips with his. A clap of thunder, loud and awful, resounded through the trembling air. All around him fell into ruin. The lovely fairy, the beautiful garden, sunk deeper and deeper. The prince saw it sinking down into the dark night till it shone only like a star in the distance beneath him. Then he felt a coldness, like death, creeping over him. His eyes closed, and he became insensible. When he recovered, a chilling rain was beating upon him, and a sharp wind blew on his head. "Alas, what have I done?" he sighed. "I have sinned like Adam, and the garden of paradise is sunk into the earth." He opened his eyes, and saw the star in the distance, but it was the morning star in heaven, which glittered in the darkness. Presently he stood up and found himself in the depths of the forest, close to the cavern of the winds, and the mother of the winds sat by his side. She looked angry, and raised her arm in the air as she spoke. "The very first evening," she said. "Well, I expected it. If you were my son, you should go into the sack." "And there he will have to go at last," said a strong old man, with large black wings and a scythe in his hand, whose name was Death. "He shall be laid in his coffin, but not yet. I will allow him to wander about the world for a while, to atone for his sin, and to give him time to become better. But I shall return when he least expects me. I shall lay him in a black coffin, place it on my head, and fly away with it beyond the stars. There also blooms a garden of paradise, and if he is good and pious, he will be admitted. But if his thoughts are bad, and his heart full of sin, he will sink with his coffin deeper than the garden of paradise is sunk. Once in every 1,000 years I shall go and fetch him, when he will either be condemned to sink still deeper, or be raised to a happier life in the world beyond the stars.
End of The Garden of Paradise. Recording by Christopher Taylor.
Section 17 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Flying Trunk. There was once a merchant who was so rich that he could have paved the whole street with gold, and would even then have had enough for a small alley. But he did not do so. He knew the value of money better than to use it in this way. So clever was he, that every shilling he put out brought him a crown, and so he continued till he died. His son inherited his wealth, and he lived a merry life with it. He went to a masquerade every night, made kites out of 5-pound notes, and threw pieces of gold into the sea instead of stones, making ducks and drakes of them. In this manner he soon lost all his money. At last he had nothing left but a pair of slippers, an old dressing gown, and 4 shillings. And now all his friends deserted him. They could not walk with him in the streets. But one of them, who was very good-natured, sent him an old trunk with this message: "Pack up." Yes, he said, it is all very well to say pack up, but he had nothing left to pack up. Therefore he seated himself in the trunk. It was a very wonderful trunk. No sooner did any one press on the lock than the trunk could fly. He shut the lid and pressed the lock, when away flew the trunk up the chimney with the merchant's son in it, right up into the clouds. Whenever the bottom of the trunk cracked, he was in a great fright, for if the trunk fell to pieces he would have made a tremendous somerset over the trees. However, he got safely in his trunk to the land of Turkey. He hid the trunk in the wood under some dry leaves, and then went into the town. He could sew this very well, for the Turks always go about dressed in dressing gowns and slippers, as he was himself. He happened to meet a nurse with a little child. "I say, you Turkish nurse," cried he, "what castle is that near the town, with the windows placed so high?" "The king's daughter lives there," she replied. "It has been prophesied that she will be very unhappy about a lover, and therefore no one is allowed to visit her unless the king and queen are present." "Thank you," said the merchant's son. So he went back to the wood, seated himself in his trunk, flew up to the roof of the castle, and crept through the window into the princess's room. She lay on the sofa asleep, and she was so beautiful that the merchant's son could not help kissing her. Then she awoke, and was very much frightened. But he told her he was a Turkish angel who had come down through the air to see her, which pleased her very much. He sat down by her side and talked to her. He said her eyes were like beautiful dark lakes in which the thoughts swam about like little mermaids, and he told her that her forehead was a snowy mountain, which contained splendid halls full of pictures. And then he related to her about the stork who brings the beautiful children from the rivers. These were delightful stories, and when he asked the princess if she would marry him, she consented immediately. "But you must come on Saturday," she said, "for then the king and queen will take tea with me. They will be very proud when they find that I am going to marry a Turkish angel. But you must think of some very pretty stories to tell them, for my parents like to hear stories better than anything. My mother prefers one that is deep and moral, but my father likes something funny to make him laugh." "Very well," he replied, "I shall bring you no other marriage portion than a story." And so they parted. But the princess gave him a sword which was studded with gold coins, and these he could use. Then he flew away to the town and bought a new dressing gown, and afterwards returned to the wood, where he composed a story, so as to be ready for Saturday, which was no easy matter. It was ready, however, by Saturday, when he went to see the princess. The king and queen and the whole court were at tea with the princess, and he was received with great politeness. "Will you tell us a story?" said the queen, "one that is instructive and full of deep learning." "Yes, but with something in it to laugh at," said the king. "Certainly," he replied, and commenced at once, asking them to listen attentively. There was once a bundle of matches that were exceedingly proud of their high descent. Their genealogical tree, that is, a large pine tree from which they had been cut, was at one time a large, old tree in the wood. The matches now lay between a tinder box and an old iron saucepan, and were talking about their youthful days. "Ah, then we grew on the green boughs, and were as green as they. Every morning and evening we were fed with diamond drops of dew. Whenever the sun shone, we felt his warm rays, and the little birds would relate stories to us as they sung. We knew that we were rich, for the other trees only wore their green dress in summer, but our family were able to array themselves in green summer and winter. But the woodcutter came, like a great revolution, and our family fell under the axe. The head of the house obtained a situation as mainmast in a very fine ship, and can sail round the world when he will. The other branches of the family were taken to different places, and our office now is to kindle a light for common people. This is how such high-born people as we came to be in a kitchen." "Mine has been a very different fate," said the iron pot which stood by the matches. "From my first entrance into the world I have been used to cooking and scouring. I am the first in this house when anything solid or useful is required. My only pleasure is to be made clean and shining after dinner, and to sit in my place and have a little sensible conversation with my neighbours. All of us, excepting the water bucket, which is sometimes taken into the courtyard, live here together within these four walls. We get our news from the market basket, but he sometimes tells us very unpleasant things about the people and the government. Yes, and one day an old pot was so alarmed that he fell down and was broken to pieces. He was a Liberal, I can tell you." "You are talking too much," said the tinder box, and the steel struck against the flint till some sparks flew out, crying, "We want a merry evening, don't we?" "Yes, of course," said the matches. "Let us talk about those who are the highest born." "No, I don't like to be always talking of what we are," remarked the saucepan. "Let us think of some other amusement. I will begin. We will tell something that has happened to ourselves. That will be very easy, and interesting as well. On the Baltic Sea, near the Danish shore—" "What a pretty commencement," said the plates. "We shall all like that story, I am sure." "Yes, well, in my youth I lived in a quiet family, where the furniture was polished, the floor scoured, and clean curtains put up every fortnight." "What an interesting way you have of relating a story," said the carpet broom. "It is easy to perceive that you have been a great deal in women's society. There is something so pure runs through what you say." "That is quite true," said the water bucket, and he made a spring with joy, and splashed some water on the floor. Then the saucepan went on with his story, and the end was as good as the beginning. The plates rattled with pleasure, and the carpet broom brought some green parsley out of the dust hole and crowned the saucepan, for he knew it would vex the others, and he thought, "If I crown him today he will crown me tomorrow." "Now let us have a dance," said the fire tongs, and then how they danced and stuck up one leg in the air. The chair cushion in the corner burst with laughter when she saw it. "Shall I be crowned now?" asked the fire tongs, so the broom found another wreath for the tongs. They were only common people, after all, thought the matches. The tea urn was now asked to sing, but she said she had a cold and could not sing without boiling heat. They all thought this was affectation, and because she did not wish to sing excepting in the parlour, went on the table with the grand people. In the window sat an old quill pen, with which the maid generally wrote. There was nothing remarkable about the pen excepting that it had been dipped too deeply in the ink, but it was proud of that. "If the tea urn won't sing," said the pen, "she can leave it alone. There is a nightingale in a cage who can sing. She has not been taught much, certainly, but we need not say anything this evening about that." "I think it highly improper," said the tea kettle, who was kitchen singer, and half brother to the tea urn, "that a rich foreign bird should be listened to here. Is it patriotic? Let the market basket decide what is right." "I certainly am vexed," said the basket, "inwardly vexed, more than any one can imagine. Are we spending the evening properly? Would it not be more sensible to put the house in order? If each were in his own place, I would lead a game. This would be quite another thing." "Let us act a play," said they all. At the same moment the door opened and the maid came in. Then not one stirred. They all remained quite still, yet, at the same time, there was not a single pot amongst them who had not a high opinion of himself, and of what he could do if he chose. Yes, if we had chosen, they each thought, we might have spent a very pleasant evening. The maid took the matches and lighted them. Dear me, how they sputtered and blazed up! "Now then," they thought, "every one will see that we are the first. How we shine! What a light we give!" Even while they spoke their light went out. "What a capital story!" said the Queen. "I feel as if I were really in the kitchen and could see the matches. Yes, you shall marry our daughter." "Certainly," said the King, "thou shalt have our daughter." The King said thou to him because he was going to be one of the family. The wedding day was fixed, and on the evening before the whole city was illuminated. Cakes and sweetmeats were thrown among the people. The street boys stood on tiptoe and shouted "Hurrah!" and whistled between their fingers. Altogether it was a very splendid affair. "I will give them another treat," said the merchant's son. So he went and bought rockets and crackers and all sorts of fireworks that could be thought of, packed them in his trunk, and flew up with it into the air. What a whizzing and popping they made as they went off! The Turks, when they saw such a sight in the air, jumped so high that their slippers flew about their ears. It was easy to believe after this that the princess was really going to marry a Turkish angel. As soon as the merchant's son had come down in his flying trunk to the wood after the fireworks, he thought, "I will go back into the town now, and hear what they think of the entertainment." It was very natural that he should wish to know. And what strange things people did say, to be sure! Every one whom he questioned had a different tale to tell, though they all thought it was very beautiful. "I saw the Turkish angel myself," said one. "He had eyes like glittering stars, and a head like foaming water." "He flew in a mantle of fire," cried another, "and lovely little cherubs peeped out from the folds." He heard many more fine things about himself, and that the next day he was to be married. After this he went back to the forest to rest himself in his trunk. It had disappeared. A spark from the fireworks which remained had set it on fire. It was burnt to ashes. So the merchant's son could not fly any more, nor go to meet his bride. She stood all day on the roof waiting for him, and most likely she is waiting there still, while he wanders through the world telling fairy tales, but none of them so amusing as the one he related about the matches. End of The Flying Trunk, recorded by Ginger Kukalo.
Section 18 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Russell. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul. The Storks. On the last house in a little village, the storks had built a nest, and the mother stork sat in it with her 4 young ones, who stretched out their necks and pointed their black beaks, which had not yet turned red like those of the parent birds. A little way off, on the edge of the roof, stood the father stork, quite upright and stiff, not liking to be quite idle. He drew up one leg and stood on the other, so still that it seemed almost as if he were carved in wood. "It must look very grand," thought he, "for my wife to have a sentry guarding her nest. They do not know that I am her husband. They will think I have been commanded to stand here, which is quite aristocratic." And so he continued standing on one leg. In the street below were a number of children at play, and when they caught sight of the storks, one of the boldest among the boys began to sing a song about them, and very soon he was joined by the rest. These are the words of the song, but each only sang what he could remember of them in his own way. Stork, stork, fly away. Stand not on one leg, I pray. See, your wife is in her nest, with her little ones at rest. They will hang one and fry another. They will shoot a third and roast his brother. Just hear what those boys are singing, said the young storks. They say we shall be hanged and roasted. Never mind what they say. You need not listen, said the mother. They can do no harm. But the boys went on singing and pointing at the storks and mocking at them, excepting one of the boys whose name was Peter. He said it was a shame to make fun of animals, and would not join with them at all. The mother stork comforted her young ones, and told them not to mind. See, she said, how quiet your father stands, although he is only on one leg. But we are very much frightened, said the young storks, and they drew back their heads into the nests. The next day, when the children were playing together and saw the storks, they sang the song again. They will hang one and roast another. Shall we be hanged and roasted? Asked the young storks. No, certainly not, said the mother. I will teach you to fly. And when you have learnt, we will fly into the meadows and pay a visit to the frogs, who will bow themselves to us in the water and cry, croak, croak, and then we shall eat them up. That will be fun. And what next? Asked the young storks. Then, replied the mother, all the storks in the country will assemble together and go through their autumn maneuvers, so that it is very important for everyone to know how to fly properly. If they do not, the general will thrust them through with his beak and kill them. Therefore you must take pains and learn, so as to be ready when the drilling begins. Then we may be killed after all, as the boys say. And hark, they are singing again. Listen to me and not to them, said the mother stork. After the great review is over, we shall fly away to warm countries far from hence, where there are mountains and forests. To Egypt, where we shall see 3-cornered houses built of stone, with pointed tops that reach nearly to the clouds. They are called pyramids, and are older than a stork could imagine, and in that country there is a river that overflows its banks, and then goes back, leaving nothing but mire. There we can walk about and eat frogs in abundance. Oh, oh, cried the young storks. Yes, it is a delightful place. There is nothing to do all day long but eat, and while we are so well off out there, in this country, there will not be a single green leaf on the trees, and the weather will be so cold that the clouds will freeze and fall on the earth in little white rags. The stork meant snow, but she could not explain it in any other way. Will the naughty boys freeze and fall in pieces? Asked the young storks. No, they will not freeze and fall into pieces, said the mother, but they will be very cold, and be obliged to sit all day in a dark, gloomy room, while we shall be flying about in foreign lands, where there are blooming flowers and warm sunshine. Time passed on, and the young storks grew so large that they could stand upright in the nest and look about them. The father brought them every day beautiful frogs, little snakes, and all kinds of stork dainties that he could find. And then, how funny it was to see the tricks he would perform to amuse them. He would lay his head quite round over his tail, and clatter with his beak, as if it had been a rattle, and then he would tell them stories all about the marshes and fens. Come, said the mother one day, now you must learn to fly, and all the 4 young ones were obliged to come out on the top of the roof. Oh, how they tottered at first, and were obliged to balance themselves with their wings, or they would have fallen to the ground below. Look at me, said the mother. You must hold your heads in this way, and place your feet so. Once, twice, once, twice. That is it. Now you will be able to take care of yourselves in the world. Then she flew a little distance from them, and the young ones made a spring to follow her, but down they fell plump, for their bodies were still too heavy. "I don't want to fly," said one of the young storks, creeping back into the nest. "I don't care about going to warm countries." "Would you like to stay here and freeze when the winter comes?" said the mother, "or till the boys comes to hang you, or to roast you?" "Well then, I'll call them." "Oh, no, no," said the young stork, jumping out on the roof with the others, and now they were all attentive, and by the third day could fly a little. Then they began to fancy they could soar, so they tried to do so, resting on their wings, but they soon found themselves falling, and had to flap their wings as quickly as possible. The boys came again in the street singing their song, "Stork, stork, fly away." "Shall we fly down and pick their eyes out?" asked the young storks. "No, leave them alone," said the mother. "Listen to me, that is much more important. Now then, 1, 2, 3. Now to the right. 1, 2, 3. Now to the left. Round the chimney. There now, that was very good. That last flap of the wings was so easy and graceful that I shall give you permission to fly with me tomorrow to the marshes. There will be a number of very superior storks there with their families, and I expect you to show them that my children are the best brought up of any who may be present. You must strut about proudly. It will look well, and make you respected." "But may we not punish those naughty boys?" asked the young storks. "No, let them scream away as much as they like. You can fly from them now up high amid the skies, and will be in the land of the pyramids when they are freezing, and have not a green leaf on the trees or an apple to eat." "We will revenge ourselves," whispered the young storks to each other, as they again joined the exercising. Of all the boys in the street who sang the mocking song about the storks, not one was so determined to go on with it as he who first began it. Yet he was a little fellow, not more than 6 years old. To the young storks he appeared at least 100, for he was so much bigger than their father and mother. To be sure, storks cannot be expected to know how old children and grown-up people are, so they determined to have their revenge on this boy, because he began the song first and would keep on with it. The young storks were very angry, and grew worse as they grew older, so at last their mother was obliged to promise that they should be revenged, but not until the day of their departure. "We must see first how you acquit yourselves at the grand review," said she. "If you get on badly there, the general will thrust his beak through you, and you will be killed, as the boys said, though not exactly in the same manner, so we must wait and see." "You shall see," said the young birds, and then they took such pains and practiced so well every day, that at last it was quite a pleasure to see them fly so lightly and prettily. As soon as the autumn arrived, all the storks began to assemble together before taking their departure for warm countries during the winter. Then the review commenced. They flew over forests and villages to show what they could do, for they had a long journey before them. The young storks performed their part so well that they received a mark of honor, with frogs and snakes as a present. These presents were the best part of the affair, for they could eat the frogs and snakes, which they very quickly did. "Now let us have our revenge," they cried. "Yes, certainly," cried the mother stork. "I have thought upon the best way to be revenged. I know the pond in which all the little children lie, waiting till the storks come to take them to their parents. The prettiest little babies lie there dreaming more sweetly than they will ever dream in the time to come. All parents are glad to have a little child, and children are so pleased with a little brother or sister. Now we will fly to the pond and fetch a little baby for each of the children who did not sing that naughty song to make game of the storks." "But the naughty boy, who began the song first, what shall we do to him?" cried the young storks. "There lies in the pond a little dead baby who has dreamed itself to death," said the mother. "We will take it to the naughty boy, and he will cry because we have brought him a little dead brother. But you have not forgotten the good boy, who said it was a shame to laugh at animals. We will take him a little brother and sister too, because he was good. He is called Peter, and you shall all be called Peter in future." So they all did what their mother had arranged, and from that day, even till now, all the storks have been called Peter. End of The Storks. Recording by Tony Russell, Bend, Oregon.
Section 19 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 1, 1835 to 1842, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. The Elf of the Rose. In the midst of a garden grew a rose tree in full blossom, and in the prettiest of all the roses lived an elf. He was such a little wee thing that no human eye could see him. Behind each leaf of the rose he had a sleeping chamber. He was as well formed and as beautiful as a little child could be, and had wings that reached from his shoulders to his feet. Oh, what sweet fragrance there was in his chambers! And how clean and beautiful were the walls! For they were the blushing leaves of the rose. During the whole day he enjoyed himself in the warm sunshine, flew from flower to flower, and danced on the wings of the flying butterflies. Then he took it into his head to measure how many steps he would have to go through the roads and crossroads that are on the leaf of a linden tree. What we call the veins on a leaf, he took for roads. Aye, and very long roads they were for him, for before he had half finished his task, the sun went down. He had commenced his work too late. It became very cold, the dew fell, and the wind blew, so he thought the best thing he could do would be to return home. He hurried himself as much as he could, but he found the roses all closed up, and he could not get in. Not a single rose stood open. The poor little elf was very much frightened. He had never before been out at night, but had always slumbered secretly behind the warm rose leaves. Oh, this would certainly be his death. At the other end of the garden he knew there was an arbor, overgrown with beautiful honeysuckles. The blossoms looked like large painted horns, and he thought to himself he would go and sleep in one of these till the morning. He flew thither, but hush! 2 people were in the arbor, a handsome young man and a beautiful lady. They sat side by side and wished that they might never be obliged to part. They loved each other much more than the best child can love its father and mother. "But we must part," said the young man. "Your brother does not like our engagement, and therefore he sends me so far away on business, over mountains and seas. Farewell, my sweet bride, for so you are to me." And then they kissed each other, and the girl wept, and gave him a rose. But before she did so, she pressed a kiss upon it so fervently that the flower opened. Then the little elf flew in, and leaned his head on the delicate, fragrant walls. Here he could plainly hear them say, "Farewell, farewell," and he felt that the rose had been placed on the young man's breast. Oh, how his heart did beat! The little elf could not go to sleep, it thumped so loudly. The young man took it out as he walked through the dark wood alone, and kissed the flower so often and so violently that the little elf was almost crushed. He could feel through the leaf how hot the lips of the young man were, and the rose had opened, as if from the heat of the noonday sun. There came another man, who looked gloomy and wicked. He was a wicked brother of the beautiful maiden. He drew out a sharp knife, and while the other was kissing the rose, the wicked man stabbed him to death. Then he cut off his head, and buried it with the body in the soft earth under the linden tree. "Now he is gone, and will soon be forgotten," thought the wicked brother. "He will never come back again. He was going on a long journey over mountains and seas. It is easy for a man to lose his life in such a journey. My sister will suppose he is dead, for he cannot come back, and she will not dare to question me about him." Then he scattered the dry leaves over the light earth with his foot, and went home through the darkness. But he went not alone as he thought. The little elf accompanied him. He sat in a dry rolled-up linden leaf, which had fallen from the tree on to the wicked man's head, as he was digging the grave. The hat was on the head now, which made it very dark, and the little elf shuddered with fright and indignation at the wicked deed. It was the dawn of morning before the wicked man reached home. He took off his hat and went into his sister's room. There lay the beautiful blooming girl, dreaming of him whom she loved so, and who was now, she supposed, traveling far away over mountain and sea. Her wicked brother stopped over her, and laughed hideously, as fiends only can laugh. The dry leaf fell out of his hair upon the counterpane, but he did not notice it, and went to get a little sleep during the early morning hours. But the elf slipped out of the withered leaf, placed himself by the ear of the sleeping girl, and told her, as in a dream, of the horrid murder, described the place where her brother had slain her lover and buried his body, and told her of the linden tree in full blossom that stood close by. "That you may not think this is only a dream that I have told you," he said, "you will find on your bed a withered leaf." Then she awoke and found it there. Oh, what bitter tears she shed! And she could not open her heart to anyone for relief. The window stood open the whole day, and the little elf could easily have reached the roses or any of the flowers, but he could not find it in his heart to leave one so afflicted. In the window stood a bush bearing monthly roses. He seated himself in one of the flowers and gazed on the poor girl. Her brother often came into the room and would be quite cheerful, in spite of his base conduct, so she dared not say a word to him of her heart's grief. As soon as night came on, she slipped out of the house and went into the wood, to the spot where the linden tree stood, and after removing the leaves from the earth, she turned it up, and there found him who had been murdered. Oh, how she wept and prayed that she also might die! Gladly would she have taken the body home with her, but that was impossible. So she took up the poor head with the closed eyes, kissed the cold lips, and shook the mold out of the beautiful hair. "I will keep this," said she, and as soon as she had covered the body again with the earth and leaves, she took the head and a little sprig of jasmine that bloomed in the wood, near the spot where he was buried, and carried them home with her. As soon as she was in her room, she took the largest flower pot she could find, and in this she placed the head of the dead man, covered it up with earth, and planted the twig of jasmine in it. "Farewell, farewell," whispered the little elf. He could not any longer endure to witness all this agony of grief. He therefore flew away to his own rose in the garden. But the rose was faded. Only a few dry leaves still clung to the green hedge behind it. "Alas, how soon all that is good and beautiful passes away," sighed the elf. After a while he found another rose, which became his home, for among its delicate, fragrant leaves he could dwell in safety. Every morning he flew to the window of the poor girl, and always found her weeping by the flower pot. The bitter tears fell upon the jasmine twig, and each day, as she became paler and paler, the sprig appeared to grow greener and fresher. One shoot after another sprouted forth, and little white buds blossomed, which the poor girl fondly kissed. But her wicked brother scolded her, and asked her if she was going mad. He could not imagine why she was weeping over that flower pot, and it annoyed him. He did not know whose closed eyes were there, nor what red lips were fading beneath the earth. And one day she sat and leaned her head against the flower pot, and the little elf of the rose found her asleep. Then he seated himself by her ear, talked to her of that evening in the arbor, of the sweet perfume of the rose, and the loves of the elves. Sweetly she dreamed, and while she dreamt her life passed away calmly and gently, and her spirit was with him whom she loved in heaven. And the jasmine opened its large white bells and spread forth its sweet fragrance. It had no other way of showing its grief for the dead, but the wicked brother considered the beautiful blooming plant as his own property, left to him by his sister, and he placed it in his sleeping room, close by his bed, for it was very lovely in appearance, and the fragrance sweet and delightful. The little elf of the rose followed it, and flew from flower to flower, telling each little spirit that dwelt in them the story of the murdered young man, whose head now formed part of the earth beneath him, and of the wicked brother and the poor sister. "We know it," said each little spirit in the flowers. "We know it, for have we not sprung from the eyes and lips of the murdered one? We know it, we know it." And the flowers nodded with their heads in a peculiar manner. The elf of the rose could not understand how they could rest so quietly in the matter, so he flew to the bees, who were gathering honey, and told them of the wicked brother. And the bees told it to their queen, who commanded that the next morning they should go and kill the murderer. But during the night, the first after the sister's death, while the brother was sleeping in his bed, close to where he had placed a fragrant jasmine, every flower cup opened, and invisibly the little spirits stole out, armed with poisonous spears. They placed themselves by the ear of the sleeper, told him dreadful dreams, and then flew across his lips and pricked his tongue with their poisoned spears. "Now have we revenged the dead," said they, and flew back into the white bells of the jasmine flowers. When the morning came, and as soon as the window was open, the rose elf, with the queen bee and the whole swarm of bees, rushed in to kill him. But he was already dead. People were standing round the bed, and saying that the scent of the jasmine had killed him. Then the elf of the rose understood the revenge of the flowers, and explained it to the queen bee, and she, with the whole swarm, buzzed about the flower pot. The bees could not be driven away. Then a man took it upon to remove it, and one of the bees stung him in the hand, so that he let the flower pot fall, and it was broken to pieces. Then everyone saw the whitened skull, and they knew the dead man in the bed was a murderer. And the queen bee hummed in the air, and sang of the revenge of the flowers, and of the elf of the rose, and said that behind the smallest leaf dwells one who can discover evil deeds,